I swear this is the last video that I'm going to be making on religion for a long time. So anyway, I've watched this video by Hunter Avallone, and while the argumentation in it isn't particularly strong, I am not going to BTFO him in any way, because this comes from a genuine place, and I think he'd really benefit from my input, and if he's watching this, please do pay attention, and please do heed my exhortations.
Hey there everybody, it's Hunter Avallone here.
Hello.
And I still remember the day I became a Christian. I was very young, maybe 6 or 7, and I was under the kitchen table, and I was having my prayer time, and I prayed that God would help me be born again. But yeah, that's kind of what I remember as the time that I became a Christian.
Now seems as good a time as any for me to elaborate on my own background. I used to be an Anglican until I was about 14, I think, and then I went through the sort of edgy atheist stage. And I realised that I became a deist about 6 months ago, because I talked to a man called Praise the Folly, and he laid out a very strong argument I have yet to see a good refutation to. So I think that shows a sort of contrast in the way we approach religion. Avallone seems to have approached it more in a sort of a family and communal sense, which kind of makes sense considering I'm assuming he's Protestant. It's probably more likely that he's Protestant considering the accent. It seems more Middle American. Whereas I approached it more from a philosophical perspective, I suppose, so I think I can give a bit more light on this particular problem.
It was kind of like this gnawing feeling, like what if you're not really a Christian? You know, am I really a Christian? And I would pray, and for some reason, I don't know how else to put this, and I know I criticize feelings so much, but for this example specifically, I would pray, I would read my Bible, you know, I would pray to become a Christian, whatever, it wouldn't matter, I just couldn't feel it. It felt like I was saying empty words. Like I didn't feel it in my heart. Like I didn't feel like I believed it. And I remember that I was sitting in church one time. I was still younger then. And the pastor said, if you don't know you're a Christian, then you probably aren't a Christian.
Did people here know that pastor or pastores means shepherd or shepherds in Latin? Now, what is the job of a shepherd, you may ask? It's to guide his sheep. To look after his sheep and keep them safe from the wolves. Now, honestly, based on what he has just said here, we can tell that this pastor wasn't doing a particularly good job, because surely if he wants to retain his herd, then surely he will help the sheep be guided towards whatever. That's the whole root of the word. So honestly, it's not really much of a surprise that Hunter Avallone experienced this, because any reasonable pastor would have sat down with the person having doubts, and he would have laid down the various arguments for the existence of a God or the validity of Christianity. And as much as the hardcore atheists may like to say there are no valid arguments for the existence of God, admittedly as a deist, and I'm kind of biased here, I would say there are, and we will get into that as and when that is relevant within the video. Because I think that, honestly, all Hunter Avallone needs to do is sit and read a bit. I think he would get a much better perspective on the world if he sat and read a lot of these texts. And I don't mean the Bible, by the way.
Somewhere around that I really started to, I guess, look critically at Christianity. You know, I got to this point, I'm not really sure when I reached this point, where I stopped worrying so much whether I really am a Christian, or like they would say things at church, like raise your hand if you want to become a Christian. And I kind of wanted to raise my hand, but I was sort of worried, like what are people going to think about me? Like I'm already supposed to be a Christian here. But I finally got to a point where I was able to just step back and look critically at Christianity and look critically at what I am claiming I believe.
So let's hear some of these then.
You know, I remember being in church and I would hear them talking. They would say something about God. I don't remember exactly what it was. And I would go into, I hate to use this word, but I would go into skeptic mode. You know, and I would be like, really? And I was just becoming more and more critical, more and more skeptical of Christianity. And I'll be honest, what didn't help was my very bad experiences I've had with Christians.
I'm not sure this is a logically sound argument. I'm not sure how, unless this thing is directly correlated or well, obviously connected with the beliefs of a certain belief system, how people being horrible to you makes the belief system horrible. And even if that was the case, that doesn't make the belief system wrong. Why would something personally offending you make something wrong? As I'm sure you've said many a time in your videos, facts don't care about your feelings. So then, why are you driven away from a belief because the people who hold it happen to be distasteful? Why not just go and find other people? No one is forcing you to associate with those people who share your beliefs, and you can't write off all people as that, as you've acknowledged in your video. So why would you factor this into your thinking at all? Surely, as I'm sure many atheists are, and I like to hope I was, they'd try to ignore emotions as much as possible. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that everyone ignores emotions all the time. I can't. I know most people can't. But at the same time, if it's something as integral to your metaphysics, to your first principles about the world as this, you should be trying as hard as possible to ignore social factors.
So moving on, yeah, I would continue to look critically at Christianity. The more critical I became of Christianity, the more, I guess, flawed it started to seem. And I'm a very logic-based person.
I don't doubt that most people in their lives try to pursue logic as much as they can. I know that I try to, although whether I do that all the time or not, I'm not entirely certain. However, I would like to point to you in your own video that before you said this, that you spent the last 2 or so minutes, I cut it out obviously, of this making an argument from pathos as opposed to logos. You appealed more to a sense of feeling than a sense of thought. And while that's all fine and fair enough, I think it requires some introspection if, after a 2-minute long rant about people disliking you and using that as what appears to be an argument, and then you saying that, I think you need to sit down and think about that one. In the nicest possible way, I'm really not trying to BTFO you here. If I wanted to BTFO you here, I would do what I did in my Rage After the Storm video. I don't dislike you in the same way I dislike Rage After Storm. So I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt here.
You know, if something isn't logical, then I have a really hard time believing it. And I've kind of reached this point where I don't know how on earth, me as a logical person, I am supposed to believe that an all-knowing spirit who came out of nothing created the earth and then hears your prayers even when you close your eyes and pray them in your mind. So I'm supposed to believe that there is a giant, all-knowing spirit floating around the earth that can read my thoughts. I mean, does this not sound crazy? And this would happen to me when I was in church, before I came to this point.
I'm going to presume that you didn't really study much into what is meant by the concept of God. Now, granted, there are many a Christian sect who believe he is something that exists in the material world, and there are other religions that believe this as well, specifically Mormonism. But I think you're kind of fucking up the concept of God here. God isn't, as you say, something that floats around the earth and can read your thoughts. God is ultimately founded in the concept of the mind being separate from the body, or more specifically, there being two sort of realms. The concept of the immaterial and the concept of the material. Now, there are some people out there who, like you, probably believe that reason is ultimately grounded in the material world and there is no such thing as an immaterial world. There are other people who believe vice versa. My own position is they are equally balanced. Now, these concepts don't come magicked out of some religious book like, say, the Bible or the Torah or the Quran, although I have a Quran next to me because I'm reading through it. They come from a lot of philosophical arguments, and I'm going to suggest a few books you should probably read. The first couple of ones, which are sort of surface level Christian apologia, would be Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I'll be doing a podcast on this on the next couple of days because I've just finished reading it with a bunch of friends. And the next one I'd recommend would be Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Now, if you want to get more specifically into why there is supposed to be some sort of spirit, I would suggest that you read through the arguments for dualism, specifically those expressed by Descartes in his Meditations. Although there are other arguments as well, you can accept what's called a monist position, which believes that one of these two realms is dominant over the other. For instance, you may have heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. Under Thomism, there is the dominance of the consciousness, the mind, and the immaterial over the material world, and you can see this running through Summa Theologica quite strongly. Hence why it's one of the fundamental metaphysics or first principles of Aquinas. I wouldn't suggest you read Summa Theologica because it's 4,000 pages. I think that Aquinas published a slightly smaller version. I think it's like 600, 700 pages. You could read that as well, or you could just go on the internet and read up the basics of these ideas. I'll link a few of these articles in the description. You can read all sorts. There are all sorts of different arguments for God. You could read, funnily enough, the Islamic theologians for arguments for God, because they make a lot of them. Some of them don't necessarily appeal to a rational sense of the world in the actual philosophical sense. Like the traditionalist school believes that the Quran is basically all that needs to be read. Although there are other branches of Islamic theology, including the Kalam or speech side, which tends to use more Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian philosophy alongside the Islamic religion in order to actualize a god. For instance, you may have heard of the Kalam argument. This comes from this school of Islamic theology and was built upon by future theologians and kind of come up with independently by other people like Leibniz and obviously Aquinas. So I think you have a lot to be reading, and I've just been doing a 4-minute long take, so you have some books to start with. Or at the very least, you can read the articles I'll link in the description, because I'm sure that at the very least, you probably gotten this skeptical perspective from watching YouTube, and you do say this later on. Now, actually, if you want that specific argument refuted, that specific view of the world refuted, I made a video called A Refutation of the Atheism of the Skeptics, and I'll link that in the description as well. Now, I've gotten a lot of criticism for this. I've gotten about 150 different pieces of criticism. I can think of about 4 that were actually relevant to the content of that video, and I say that charitably.
Layers of fossils, but creationists claim there's a worldwide flood. If there was a flood, wouldn't it make more sense that the fossils would be mixed up and scattered all over the place?
You are aware that fossils are actually part of the rock, right? You're aware that they chisel around the rock to get them out. Now, the problem is that actually does destroy a lot of fossils. There are certain hydrogeological, I suppose I'll call them, processes like longshore drift which do erode fossils. The Great Flood myth, actually, even if that did happen, which I'm doubtful of, I think it's probably more reminiscent of a earlier Mesopotamian myth referring to Enki and Enlil. Even if that did happen, then I don't see how that would destroy the fossils.
But no, instead we find layers upon layers. Another thing is, creationists make a complete ludicrous claim that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I don't believe that for a second. Whether I'm a Christian or not, I do not believe that. There are stars in our galaxy, and the amount of time it would take for the light beam to go from the star and hit our Earth is longer than 6,000 years. How on earth can the universe be 6,000 years old when there is proven evidence, proven fact, that there are things older than 6,000 years old? And besides being just generally ignorant to specific facts, I started to see other flaws in Christianity. And one of my biggest problems with Christianity being the way it seems to be a bit of a circle jerk. You know, Christians say, well, God is real. Okay, we'll prove it. Well, it says so in the Bible.
I'm assuming you have no concept of theology, right? I'm assuming that you've never heard of Aquinas or Calvin or Luther or William of Ockham or Saint Augustine or Tertullian, because I think you'll find that they've been writing texts on things like this for the past 1,700 years at the least, since the Council of Nicaea. Probably before that, if you really look, but I'm not really certain on that. I think I'd have to ask someone who's really an expert on the early church fathers for that. But they've been writing these books for a very long time, and these arguments don't all derive from the Bible. I mean, for instance, there was the Aristotelian revival during the 14th century, and that obviously changed a lot of perspectives within the Catholic Church. So I'm not really sure where you're deriving this from.
And the way I think is, how is that any different than a feminist saying, hey, Hunter, guess what? The wage gap is real. And me saying, okay, well, why don't you go ahead and prove that? She goes, yeah, go to feminism.com.
And likewise, the feminists have their foundation in a good level of their own theology. We call it philosophy, though, I suppose. Although I really would like to call it theology. People like Derrida and the post-structuralists, postmodernists, as you've often heard them referred to, they sort of built up a lot of the ideas that support feminist action. And I've even heard some existentialists sort of cobbled in there as well. For instance, I remember being told somewhere that Heidegger is a postmodernist, but I thought he was an existentialist. Either way, the philosophy of the 20th and late 19th century has a very strong influence on these feminists. Now, of course, I wouldn't expect most feminists to be aware of that, because most feminists aren't interested in that. They're interested in acting on what they believe in, rather than actually discovering the roots of what they believe in itself. But still, I still find the same sort of weird argument here that doesn't really make any sense. The logic is kind of flawed behind this, I think. But this is not because you are stupid. This is because you probably aren't aware of what I'm talking about. And that's because I've dedicated a lot of my time to reading. So, in order to get a better perspective on these things, I suggest you start reading as well.
It's just this circular logic. It just goes back into itself. And a lot of Christians will say, Hunter, you don't think that God is real because you're not spending time with God. You're just not spending enough time with him. Well, I want to show you something. This is my little friend, Wheezy. Wheezy was given to me as a present when I was like 4 years old from my grandparents. Wheezy is a little stuffed animal that I used to talk to when I was younger. And I would have a conversation with this stuffed animal for 20, 30 minutes, or until I got tired enough to just set him down and go to sleep. But the thing is, the more time I spent talking to this fake stuffed animal, and the more I made this stuffed animal talk back to me, the more real Wheezy started to feel. And by the time I actually put Wheezy down so that I could fall asleep, I felt like this was a real stuffed animal. The more time I spent talking to Wheezy, the more real it became. The more time you spend, yes, of course, if every single day you get down on your knees and go, "Dear Jesus, please hear my prayers," every moment you're spending praying and talking to God, then of course God is going to start to feel more real. But just if he starts to feel more real, doesn't mean he is real.
Now, I have two responses to this. The first one is that, in a sense, the sentiment in which you interacted with that toy, or in a sense you could say the spirit, in the sense of a thought that is within a mind, did indeed exist. Now, of course, it would be fallacious, in fact it would be dead wrong to say that that is alive in the same sense as a human being, but there is an immaterial sense to it, which you have created. The second thing I have to say to you is that you are treating God as if it is some sort of material, tangible, weighable thing, which the penguin obviously is. That's like saying that blueberry muffins are non-contingent, in a certain way. God is something that is immaterial, you can't weigh it, and you can't measure it using scientific equipment. You can reason it into, reason it, but you can't test for it empirically, which is a lot of what my refutation video was on. So you basically got it kind of wrong-headed.
Because just like Wheezy felt really real, Wheezy is not real. Alright? He's a dumb little stuffed animal. And I don't know if Bigfoot is real or not, but why do you think people who dedicate their entire lives to searching for Bigfoot, even though they've never found Bigfoot, are dead set on the fact that Bigfoot must exist? Because the more time you dedicate to anything, the more real it becomes. But just if it becomes real to you, doesn't mean that it actually exists.
Well, I would say that the thought can be said to exist. Whether or not it pervades a universal truth to the universe, I am obviously going to disagree on.
Another thing about God, and this is a very typical thing said by a lot of the, I hate saying skeptics, but I don't know what else to say. God is what's called, I believe it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis. That's the idea that just if you can't prove something doesn't exist, it must exist.
Well, like I said to you, the concept of the unfalsifiable hypothesis is repeated quite a lot in this sort of area. And that's because, honestly, you cannot test for something that's immaterial. The majority of religious people don't believe God to be a material thing. And thus, considering the empirical method is concerned by what we can sense, and what we can sense, at least we can, touch, we can taste, we can look at, is within the material world. So, of course, it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis, because the hypotheses are processed through the scientific method, which is ultimately founded on our senses. We must reason God. Just because something is an unfalsifiable hypothesis within natural philosophy doesn't mean that there aren't other means of deriving that. For instance, rational philosophy. How do you think that the Pythagorean theorem came about? It certainly didn't come about because people drew triangles and came to that conclusion, because triangles are by definition abstract objects.
So if I say, I can shoot rainbows out of my finger, but only when you're not looking. You have your eyes closed. I can shoot rainbows out of this finger. Can you prove me wrong? No. Does that mean I can shoot rainbows out of my finger? Also no. Another thing I hear from Christians, anytime someone dies, God has a plan. I know it's so hard to believe this, but trust me, God has a plan for you. This is part of God's plan. There was one thing that struck me thinking of this logic, and that is 9/11, the Twin Towers, and that very famous footage of the man jumping from the towers, plummeting to his death. And it was videos like that, and I saw that video and I thought, really? So God has a plan. Is that part of God's plan for that guy to jump off that building? I'm asking. I'm asking like myself. Is that part of God's plan to just go for that man to jump off the building, that innocent guy who did nothing wrong, who has a family, to jump off the building?
So, I think you're missing a very fundamental part of Christian theology, and that is the concept of free will. Now, God created us in his image, at least according to Christian theology, and part of the properties that he gave us as people is free will. And things like 9/11, things like, say, a cartel member being executed by another cartel member in a relatively gruesome fashion on 4chan, these are all byproducts of free will. But I don't suspect you're asking that. I suspect what you're asking is, why is there necessary to be suffering? Now, a lot of people would tell you to go and read the book of Job, but in my own conception as a deist, I believe something entirely different. Admittedly, I do believe that the God who is the creator of the universe is very distant, and thus doesn't really interfere. So that's part of it. But I also believe that these horrible things happening to people are part of what makes us strong as people. And I say this through my own tribulations. I say, as somebody who's been through less than spectacular circumstances in my entire life, I look back on it and I think it was shit, but at the same time I contrast it in my own mind with what I've learned from that situation, and I think, well, I have learned something from that. Now, it may be that if I'm wrong about God, and that God is a kind of God that interferes with the world on a daily basis, that these things happen in order to teach the majority a moral lesson or a lesson of behaviour. But I'm not convinced I believe that myself, so I'll just leave that to you.
Are you really going to try to tell me that's part of God's plan? And, I think another common thing Christians would say is, well, God's going to use this to bring other people to him. God's going to use this horrible thing that happened to bring other people to him. Well, I'm sorry, but that seems like a really skewed God who's going to allow innocent people to die so that other people could come to salvation. And if he's God, why doesn't he just allow them to come to salvation without letting an innocent life die?
So what I'd say to you on that when it comes to Christian theology is that God is said to make us in the same way a sculptor makes a statue. Now, if a sculptor could believe that by destroying one of his statues he could make all of the statues better, so perhaps maybe going on a trial run, for instance. I'm sure we can see this with Rosie O'Donnell. Maybe he would do it. I think I'd do it if I was a sculptor. But to answer the second part, why does he not remove all of the suffering? I think that has something to do with free will. I think that has to do with the ability of God to allow man to do harm unto other men. Because ultimately, being made in his image, then that rationally follows, doesn't it?
So I'm kind of in this weird place in my life where I'm sort of torn, because it's like one half of me doesn't want to let go of Christianity because it's all I've ever known. You know, I know I bashed on Christians, but at the same time, some of my friends are Christian. And some of my good friends that I've gotten to know, I have gotten to know them through church. And I just find Christian logic to be so skewed. And so, like, I don't know.
You should not be thinking in a social sense when it comes to your points of view. Socrates actually said this in Apology. He believed that death and social pressure should ultimately be transcended by the pursuit of justice and truth. What you should be worried about isn't your friends as much as you like them, because, you know, funnily enough, I have friends as well, and I quite like them as well. What you should be thinking about is pursuing the truth of the matter as far as you can. Now, some people find that truth in atheism. I would disagree with them, but then again, I don't claim to know all the arguments for theism, deism, or atheism, so I don't know how they got to that conclusion. Although, based on my own video, I'm not sure it was on particularly rational grounds myself, in the layman's sense, not the philosophical sense. So yeah, I would follow the argument where it leads. If you wish to be some sort of paragon of logic, I would be sitting down and reading as much philosophy as I could get my hands on. Be that economics, be that natural philosophy, be that theology, be that the philosophy of aesthetics. Just go and read and try and find this pervading truth. Now, this may lead you to believe no truth, but still, you can say that you tried.
This whole video, I guess, was just made for me to say I don't know. I don't know how I can continue to believe something that seems to have zero factual backing. But at the same time, I don't know how I can just, you know, abandon Christianity and go over to atheism, because I don't know how I can accept that this amazing earth and everything on it that is so unique and so intricate could have happened by random chance, or could have happened by an explosion, or could have just evolved out of nothing. So yeah, guys, that was just kind of a little heart-to-heart about religion. I don't want you to think of me as an atheist either, because I'm certainly not an atheist. Not yet, anyway.
I hope this video finds you. Now, I do say for a reason that I think you're an atheist throughout this video, because honestly, you've said that you are a very logical person, but the only arguments you are making for Christianity are founded in social and founded in community, which makes me think in your own heart you've dismissed it yourself. Like your own head, you've dismissed it. So that's why I've called you that throughout. I'm sure that's probably wound you up a little bit. Anyway, so if you really like this, please like. If you are like, oh my god, I really love this, subscribe, and you can give me money on Patreon if you really, really are that inclined. Not sure why you would, but you can do it if you want. If you disliked it, obviously dislike. If you really, really want to have a go at me over something, write a comment. I read them all. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you guys later, and goodbye.